Good afternoon. I am wonderful Bob Brown, Senior Fellow here at Brookings, and thank you very much for staying to the last panel, very exciting one on some of the most difficult and intractable issues in Mexico and in the U.S. Mexico relationship. We'll speak about drugs, criminality, as well as immigration issues, something President Trump inappropriately tends to lump together, and he's issued a range of policies that are highly controversial in Mexico and highly controversial in the United States. I'll be moderating the panel as well as lead of the discussion on security issues in Mexico, and then we transition to the border. Let me introduce my two distinguished colleagues on the panel. First, Boris Meisner, who will be speaking about the border relationship. Doris was a high administration official during the Clinton administration. In fact, she was the commissioner for what was then the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, and not only lived and dealt with many of the issues at the time, but also made some enormous progress at the time in dealing with issues such as managing the border, but also improving naturalization, setting in procedures for refugees issues, and leading and really at the time being at the core of improving U.S.-Mexico collaboration on immigration issues. So in many ways, a lot of Doris's key work at the time is now being overthrown, perhaps not, by the Trump administration, and we are absolutely thrilled that you could join us. Doris today is a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute that she, in fact, started after also being senior associate at Carnegie. We will then hear from Audrey Single, my colleague. I still claim Audrey as my colleague here at Brookings. Audrey is a non-resident senior fellow these days and used to be senior fellows here, and also a very prominent expert on immigration refugee issues. I would highly recommend her recent book on how cities, particularly middle-level cities, deal with integrating immigrants, called 21st Century Gateways. It's, again, one of the issues that we hear a lot today in the presidential rhetoric, in the White House rhetoric, and, in fact, from cities as well, about issues of sanctuary cities, the dealing with migrants. But there are many dimensions to it, and the integration is crucial and can be done effectively, as you will learn in Audrey's book. And Audrey also used to be at Carnegie as a senior associate there, and is now also at the Migration Policy Institute. At the Urban Institute. But at one point you were at the MPI also.
I was at the previous incarnation.
The previous incarnation of MPI.
Before
okay.
MPI was MPI.
Okay, thank you very much. So I hope that you will all stay robustly engaged as the last panel, and look forward to your questions after we make our remarks. You know, as I mentioned, I'll kick us off with the question that has not so far had much airing in the panel, in the conversation that we had today, namely the murder rates in Mexico. Which, however, is enormous by all standards. You might have been following some of the recent controversy in U.S. media as to whether Mexico is the second most violent country in the world after Syria. And there are disputes whether that is the case. But last year, between 21 and 23,000 people were murdered in Mexico. That is a very, very high number. And the number is not unique. There are several aspects to the number, one of which is that really it goes back to what were sort of the most intense murder years of the Calderon era between 2010 and 2012. There was, for a while, at the beginning of the Peña administration, a decline in murder rates that some attributed to better government policy, others, including myself, attributed to changes in the criminal markets but those have been ephemeral. And so since 2006, some 180,000 people, and possibly considerable larger number, have been murdered in Mexico. Think about that, 20,000, 23,000 murders per year. That's more intense violence than insurgency violence in Afghanistan. Now, in the United States last year, we had 15,000 murders. But we are also a country with a much bigger population, so in terms of the rate, it's very different. And the structure and character of homicides in the US is not always, but often quite different than the structural criminal violence in Mexico, with criminal groups engaging in real warfare among themselves and also against the state. So I mentioned that for a while we have seen some declines in murders that President Peña Nieto tried to claim for himself as a success of policies, of government policies, but that have now seemed to evaporate. And we have seen steady increase in violence for the past 2 years. And you heard earlier Ambassador Tony Wayne saying that if the current violence continues, this year will be the new record since 2006, and in fact, the new record historically in Mexico in terms of homicides. What is the explanation? What's driving this violence? Well, there is a set of factors, and I'll briefly speak about them, that are both immediate, precipitating factors or drivers, and more deeper structural drivers. The immediate precipitating factor is the split and infighting in the Sinaloa cartel. That is the biggest of the Mexican criminal groups. It's also by far the most successful of the Mexican criminal groups, and one that has the greatest presence in the United States. Between 40–60% of wholesale drug trafficking into United States is handled, I don't say controlled, handled by Sinaloa. And the leader of Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo Guzman, who has been extradited to the United States, often gets credit as sort of master logistician, one of the most successful drug traffickers ever. But in many ways, his genius, his criminal genius, lay in his ability to put in succession systems and succession procedures into the leadership of Sinaloa in a way that other criminal groups in Mexico were uninterested or unable to do so. And so a lot of the violence that has swept up Mexico since 2006 has to do with infighting, fragmentation, and division among the criminal groups that until about a year ago, Sinaloa was able to avoid. And that changed a year ago, where we are finally seeing splintering. His deputy or co-leader, El Mayo Zambada, who was also very effective in dealing with avoiding infighting and holding the group together, seems to be ill. And the second deputy, known by the nickname as El Licenciado, has initiated split and violence. He was arrested at the beginning of this month, but it's probably not enough to now bring the group back together, or at least we don't know whether that's the case. And of course, when the infighting within the cartel started taking place and starting very visibly playing out on the streets of Mexico, that attracted other criminal groups that were subservient in the orbit of Sinaloa cartel to also try attack over turf. And so groups in Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, other places that were essentially paying homage to Sinaloa are now fighting with the various factions of Sinaloa, try to get a bigger piece of the action. And that's very much driving upticks in violence in several places. And combining with that is also the rise of a newish group called the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel that, like the Zetas previously, is enormously aggressive, tries to take over large territories, wants to get territories close to the border with the United States, which are much more profitable than the core region where it operates, and tries to rule through sheer brutality and aggression. So the rise of Jalisco, another major precipitating factor of the current violence. But the structural, deeper issue of the violence is the continuing weakness and inability of the Mexican law enforcement system to generate deterrence capacity. Notice that the infighting within Sinaloa and Jalisco is playing out in Mexico in massive homicide rates. The same groups operate in the United States, yet there are no news. And in fact, there is no infighting among those groups operating here. Jalisco has a much smaller presence, but Sinaloa, various factions have presence, and yet we don't see that behavior. Because US law enforcement still has very strong deterrence capacity and is able, in many settings, and we can talk about Chicago and UNA, for example, to prevent this escalation in violence. Whereas with all the efforts at police reform in Mexico since the 1980s, and particularly since 2006, Mexican law enforcement still cannot do it. So when there has been decreases in violence in the early Peña years, it was really what I called narco peace, a peace at the discretion of the criminal groups. When the criminal groups no longer have the capacity or interest to enforce the peace, we are back to enormous slaughter, enormous competition, violent competition over turf. And of course, the Mexican policy choice of so-called high-value targeting, which is driving the splintering of the group, is only precipitating the problems, or it's only increasing, intensifying the problem. So it's a strategy that's relatively easy to implement, but in the current setting, very questionable and problematic. I finally want to conclude about also focusing on the issue of heroin production in Mexico and US demand. That's what Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Kelly spoke about in Mexico. I think it was very important that both of them strongly acknowledge shared responsibility, saying that Secretary Tillerson put it that we own the problem because our demand is what is driving Mexico's criminal violence, a very strong statement. And they also both promised that the US will finally reduce its demand. Now, and particularly poppy production and its expansion has driven violence in certain parts of Mexico, in the Tierra Caliente areas of Michoacán, Guerrero, Jalisco. Now, I think it's very important that we reduce demand. I also know it's enormously difficult, and I'm very skeptical of many of the policies that the Trump administration is putting forth. Particularly resurrecting highly punitive approaches to drug users, the statements from Attorney General Sessions about maximum penalties being applied to nonviolent offenders, something that was a big bipartisan breakthrough during the Obama administration to move away from incarceration. I am very skeptical when I hear of policies based around abstinence and messaging, just say no to drugs. We have run that experiment many times, it's not worked. I'm enormously worried when I see efforts at Obamacare, which, for one thing, brought medical insurance and mental health insurance to many addicts. And now about 3 million addicts are at risk of losing any access to treatment and medical support. So again, very counterproductive policy. And more broadly, President Trump applauding apparently President Duterte and suggesting that this is a extraordinary way of dealing with drug users is enormously frightening and frankly inappropriate and counterproductive. And I don't believe that the wall will stop drugs. Traffickers will go under it, over it, around it, by the sea. They'll get the drugs over as they have always done. But meanwhile, the wall and the broader rhetoric of the U.S. Mexico relationship, as you have been hearing during the afternoon all day, has enormous repercussion for U.S. Mexico cooperation, including in security issues. And of course, the wall is also tearing at communities, the border communities, but much beyond. Doris, if you could please speak about what the wall and the border is like, how it can be improved, but how can also damage, how the policies can damage border communities and beyond.
Okay, well, that's a sobering beginning. And I don't know that I have a little more optimism in some of the things that I'll talk about. But let me pick up on that from the standpoint of the U.S.-Mexico border. quickly past, present, future from the standpoint of migrant flows. We all know, of course, that the border is many things. It connects our two countries in very good ways and also in some bad ways. Obviously, trade and travel and interdependent communities and shared water and environment and so forth are all features of the border that go on day in and day out. There are also the issues that you point to more fully with crime, contraband, and illegal crossings of various kinds. But I think it's fair to say that for most of the U.S. public who don't know the border, who aren't familiar with it, who don't live there, it is really a separate region. The U.S. Mexico border is really about one thing, and that is illegal immigration from Mexico. That's how it's understood, that's how it's portrayed, that is certainly how it's been discussed in our recent politics. And so that's the perception, and to the degree that perception is reality, that's a reality that we, continue to deal with. Now, it certainly is true that Mexico has, of course, been the source of large flows of illegal migrants for many years, decades, really beginning in the 1970s. But that has changed dramatically since the mid-2000s, really almost going on 10 years now, for a combination of reasons that came together both in changes in Mexico as well as changes in the United States. And they're pretty familiar probably to an audience like this. First, very significant demographic change in Mexico. Fertility has come down markedly, and so there just isn't the same kind of burgeoning into the labor market of young people mismatched with the numbers of jobs that are available. Secondly, Mexico got its economics pretty well on a good course in the 1990s, and so there has been sustained growth and there has been job development macro in Mexico. From the U.S. side, we had, of course, a historic recession in 2006 to 8, and that really reduced the demand in the United States for the supply of jobs and the demand for workers that have been going on for decades. And we have invested enormously in U.S. Mexico border enforcement, so that investment in border enforcement really has yielded a modern enforcement machine at the U.S. Mexico border, and that has made a difference. So the result of all of that is that the large-scale illegal immigration from Mexico that has been a reality for probably 40 years really has become a thing of the past, despite what the impressions are. I mean, there is no net new illegal immigration today from Mexico, and that has been the case for quite a few years now. It doesn't mean that there aren't crossings, illegal crossings, but the scale is an entirely different phenomenon than what it is that we've experienced, as I say, since the beginning of the 1970s. And there's no reason to believe that it would rebound unless there would be some sharp economic shock in Mexico, which obviously always could happen, but there isn't any real reason to believe that that's imminent in any way. So we're dealing with a new reality. And that new reality is that illegal crossings, migrant crossings at the southwest border, are now really a function of migration from the Central American countries, the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, then from Mexico. 2014 was the first year that crossings from the Northern Triangle outpaced those from Mexico. That has continued, and 2016 is an even larger amount of Central American crossings as compared to Mexican crossings. A lot of that Central American flow is traditional economic migration as we've always experienced it, endemic poverty, people fleeing for jobs and for a better life in the United States. But more recently, a good share of that migration is a function of serious upsurges in violence and criminal gang activity in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And in particular, of course, that migration is characterized by especially vulnerable groups, women and children, and often unaccompanied children. So you have a very different kind of a circumstance in terms of what's happening and what the responses to it would be. But I want to just underscore the change with a couple of numbers because it does continue to be so mischaracterized in the United States from the standpoint of border control, the effectiveness of law enforcement at the southwest border, et cetera. So just to give you a couple numbers, in 2000 was the high point in apprehensions of people coming into the United States. 1.6 million apprehensions at the southwest border in 2000. 98% of them were Mexican nationals coming to the United States for jobs and work. In the past 5 years, that has dropped to an average of about 400,000, 1.6 million to 400,000. That's a huge drop. And half of that number is now, a little more than half, is now people from Central America. It's no longer people from Mexico. Another way to illustrate the change in the nature of the flow is this number, which is that 10 years ago, 1 in 100 border crossings was an unaccompanied child or a migrant from Central America seeking protection. Today, last year, 2016, that is down to 1 in 3. So from 1 in 100 to 1 in 3. Those are very significant changes. So what we have with the Central American flow is in some ways a flow that's similar to Mexico, but in many ways is different from the Mexican flow. It's a mixed flow. It's part economic, it's part refugee flow. And that poses different challenges for border enforcement and for U.S. policy. First of all, when children come on their own, traveling alone as an unaccompanied child, they have a right under law to a hearing before an immigration judge. That's a set of procedures that hasn't been the case by and large with the Mexican flow. Adults who come in the Central American flow seeking protection may request political asylum in the United States, and about half of them do so. Those are processes, the hearings before an immigration judge, the request for political asylum, those are processes that are handled by the immigration courts and by political asylum adjudicators. They are not subject to changing because of a wall or because of additional Border Patrol agents. So the systems that are suited to deal with this kind of a flow are systems that haven't, by and large, had to be invoked before at the southwest border, and they are systems that are badly overstretched, severely overburdened in terms of workload. Wait times for hearings, before judges, for interviews, before asylum officers can range, depending on where you are in the country, anywhere from 2 years to 5 years. And so any kind of a review whatsoever is a long time in the distance, which actually contributes to the incentive to come to the United States. So what are the policy takeaways? These are significant changes. I'd say that there are really 2 big takeaways. One is that smart investments today for effective border management and control ought to be in buttressing our immigration court system and our asylum adjudication system so that they can deliver timely, fair decisions. If you can do timely, fair decisions on petitions, on requests, applications for protection and relief, you uphold the commitment that we have as a country to providing humanitarian protection when people, in fact, have legitimate refugee claims, but you also create deterrence against people coming simply to get into a backlog in order to spend time in the United States without a decision being made on what happens in the future. Longer term, though, there is the fundamental issue here of the drivers, of what it is that generates this migration from Central America. And there, I do think that there is somewhat of an analogy with Mexico, looking back over the last 20 to 40 years. And that is that the changes that I've described with Mexico, I think could not have occurred. The changes in the U.S. Mexico migration relationship and the changes in the flow from Mexico could not have occurred without the macro decision and reality of NAFTA. And so NAFTA, as the big, broad difference in the relationship between the United States and Mexico, created the conditions for other things to kick in over time, and not really over that much time in the scheme of things as these things go. So how do we use that? What do we learn from that where Central America is concerned? Well, I think where Central America is concerned, we have a big project. And it's a big project that both the United States and Mexico have an interest in and need to come together around, because these issues of violence in Central America, obviously of poverty, of weak governments, weak government presence, are going to continue to be a source of that flow until those circumstances change over time. And if they don't change, no matter what we do at the border, no matter what we do in our courts and our asylum system, we'll still be dealing only with the symptoms, not with the deeper reasons.
Doris, before I go to Audrey, let me just ask you questions on asylum, which is one of the issues that the Trump administration is looking at. I mean, the reality right now is that people who are coming from Central America are overwhelmingly denied asylum because criminal violence is not one of the categories, correct, that qualifies for threat recognized for which asylum should be granted.
Yes and no. I mean, the actual grant rates are quite high, depending on what you call high, but they're in the 40 percentiles. And for this kind of a mixed flow, that's a reasonable response. The difficulty with a mixed flow, of course, is that you have to do everything individually, and you have to look at cases individually. There's a lot that we could do to improve the way in which the system works and actually handles the cases. But there is a larger argument, as I think you're probably suggesting, about whether these conditions, as we see them, are amenable to what our legal definition is and what the international definition is for refugee status. But one could get to that discussion and that set of issues if one even had a more functional system.
Mm-hmm. And so the corollary question for that is the Trump administration is, in its executive orders, proposed giving field officers much greater leeway to decide who should even be sent in front of an asylum judge. Is that a good policy? Well,
I mean, that's definitely what some of the reporting from the field is. People are saying that people are being turned away. I don't think that we know that to be actually the case, and that's not really it's not really in the interests of officers on the ground and of the Border Patrol to do that. They are really much happier just taking these cases and giving them over to others, because returning people to Central America is a much more complicated endeavor than it is to be just dealing with people in Mexico where you're right next door. So that is a fear and that is a concern, but that goes along with the fact that the numbers are considerably down for the moment, which probably is a Trump effect in terms of all of the rhetoric about enforcement and about muscularity in immigration enforcement. I think we have to wait and see.
Mm-hmm. Well, Audrey, the issue of migration, immigration goes well beyond the border. The border has a standard definition of certain numbers of kilometers away, but the relationship, the membrane that connects the U.S. organism and the Mexico organism connects the tissue far deeper. Migrants are present in the northern state of the United States and many other areas. Please speak to us about immigration Trump policies and how wise immigration policies should evolve.
That's great. Thank you, Vanda. Thanks for inviting me on this panel. It's great to be back at Brookings. I want to talk about 3 pieces of this issue and build a little bit on Doris's points that she's made.
Sorry, forgot to do the obligatory.
I wanted to, I'll remember that, Doris. I want to talk about a little more about the changing patterns of migration, but take a longer view so you can understand how we've gotten, many of you already know, how we've gotten to where we are and what that means for communities within the United States, changing demographic, economic, and policy conditions in both countries. Doris touched a bit on that as well. And then the implication of changing interior and border enforcement for families and workers on both sides of the border. So if we take a longer view on U.S. Mexico or Mexican migration to the United States, it's clear that one of the biggest drivers over time has always been economic opportunities in the United States as a pull factor. And as a push factor, until recently, fewer opportunities in Mexico. But somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, things started changing in terms of policy, admissions policies for Mexicans coming into the United States. In particular, after World War II, we had a large temporary agricultural program, the Bracero program, that brought in seasonal, mostly male, mostly agricultural workers who stayed until the 1960s. When that program stopped, there were many fewer ways for agricultural and low-skilled workers from Mexico to come into the United States legally. However, relationships between workers and employers had been built over time, networks had been established, social, familial, and economic, and many migrants continued to come to the United States, and many of them still worked for, in the same jobs over a longer period of time. In the 1980s, with the buildup of a pretty sizable undocumented population, things started to change. We had the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which not only legalized a few million people in the United States, it also enhanced our enforcement. At the time, enforcement enhancements were made. That was followed by some big along the border enhancements to our enforcement. And so at that point, it's been demonstrated by a bunch of scholars that migrants that used to flow seasonally back and forth to the U.S. for temporary work were now staying longer term in the United States and building their lives here. And somewhere in the 1990s, families started consolidating in the United States, and we saw many more new arrivals who were not like the traditional kinds of migrants that flowed back and forth pretty easily. So what had become seasonal and largely male was now permanent and very diverse in terms of age and sex, but also in terms of a growing proliferation of legal statuses. And at the same time, there was plenty of legal migration from Mexico to the United States, further solidifying these social and economic ties between the two countries. The size of the undocumented population rose from about 3 million in 1990 to what it is. There was a high point somewhere right before the recession of over 12 million, and now we have sort of plateaued at around 11 million estimated to be in the U.S., and a little bit, around half of those are from Mexico. And as Doris mentioned, net undocumented migration from Mexico is flat now, is zero. And more Central Americans have been arriving until just a few months ago, I would say. So what began as a temporary legal migration grew over time to a longer term, mostly permanent, mixed status, diverse demographic population from Mexico. In terms of changing conditions on both sides of the border, I'll give you some examples from communities in the United States. So if we think more recently, prior to the Great Recession, many of our metropolitan areas, particularly in Sunbelt regions of the United States, experienced a lot of economic growth, a lot of job growth, and this boom attracted migrants from within the U.S., from other areas in the U.S. to places like Las Vegas and Phoenix and areas in North Carolina, Atlanta, metropolitan areas in Texas, and also attracted many migrants from abroad who were attracted to the construction industry. We had a construction boom going on, leading right up to the recession. Then the banking crisis hit, the recession set in, and economic growth in this country largely paused in most places, and in some places worse than others. A lot of associated things happened then. We don't have to talk about that. But as the opportunities to work in the United States and these growing communities receded, immigration from Mexico slowed, and in particular undocumented migration slowed. But the perception persisted that the border was out of control. But at this point, many of the people who were to stay here were already largely in the United States. It's also important to note that during the same time, we were ramping up our enforcement efforts at the border. There were major operations happening at various popular crossing points, which meant, in Texas and California largely, which meant migrants and traffickers and smugglers were looking for other places. And they found new places which were largely ignored before because they were considered dangerous, for example, through the Sonoran Desert. But people started flowing through Arizona, and this is, I'm talking again, prior to the recession. And that's precisely at the time that, for example, Phoenix was becoming a major regional job center with a lot of economic growth going on, building, and people headquartering their businesses there. So there was a reason to stay in Arizona for the first time. So this build-up in places like that fueled the perception that things were out of control. And things happened very quickly in a lot of places and caused social and cultural disruption, lots of politics, as we know, and state and local leaders started taking matters into their own hands. So just to give you an example, the job growth in Phoenix during the period 1980 to 2000 was 3 times the job growth of the U.S. as a whole. So we see this in a bunch of different places across the country. At the same time in Mexico, as Doris mentioned, birth rates were dropping. So in 1965, sort of a critical moment in our immigration policy history, the birth rate was a little bit over 7 children per woman. It's now 2.3 per woman, which is barely above replacement rate. So there's a couple of other factors that have helped to reduce migration from Mexico to the U.S. That are related to the birth rate. A lot of research points to the fact that economic opportunities and educational opportunities and the acquisition of human capital, Mexico-specific human capital for the Mexican economy has really increased opportunity, particularly for young people. And fewer young people are making the trek north. And that means younger people especially are starting to stay in Mexico. And that's part of the change that we see. So the result is there's a shrinking pool of migrants who are actually interested in coming to the United States. And we see that as we look at the statistics in the decline of people making those kinds of moves. What are the implications of current changes, thinking ahead to border and interior enforcement mechanisms that are starting to come into place? Well, if we look at the deportation priorities in the last administration, the Obama administration towards the very end prioritized removing migrants, unauthorized migrants who were national security threats, who were convicted gang members, who were migrants who were convicted of serious crimes, and those who had crossed the border very recently. And that the Obama administration used prosecutorial discretion to deprioritize unauthorized immigrants who weren't serious threats, and also recognize that people did have deep ties in the U.S. and families had people of various statuses, including a lot of households that had U.S. citizen children with at least one parent who was undocumented. The deportation focus currently in the Trump administration, first and foremost, all of the Obama policies have been rescinded. These policies prioritize a much broader class of immigrants, but also includes similar kinds of security threats and convicted criminals, but also those with final orders of removal, regardless of their ties to the United States. There's broader discretionary power among individual enforcement officers, or there could be. And there have been reports that arrests in the first few months of this administration are up by over 1/3 as compared to the same period last year. But I would take that with a grain of salt, because we know that these things have cycles, and we need a much longer period of time to really evaluate those numbers compared to years in the past. So what does this mean for families? Family disruption has a lot of implications in U.S. communities, in labor markets, in schools, in children's lives here, and also for the workforce, for communities, and for families in Mexico, those who've been deported, those that have been separated, and those that have been reunited. In the last couple of months, since the new enforcement priorities have been carried out, they've created widespread fear in communities across the United States, because there's the perception that immigrants are getting picked up at random. And there's also the reality that immigrants who were known to U.S. enforcement officials have been deported on the spot, and that's sending a lot of fear around for wider ripple effects in those communities. There are lots of reports of what's happening in schools, among school children, where and there's a lot of talk within families, and children see other classmates either missing or their parents are being removed. It can be very disruptive. At the same time, Mexico, if this continues, if there's a pace that ramps up, I mean, there were already hundreds of thousands of Mexicans being deported in the last couple of years, but if we see a change in either size or the composition of returnees, Mexico is going to have to step up their efforts to think about what it means to have a lot of returnees who may need supportive services, whose children may need language services, and youth who are entering the labor market for the first time, and adults even, are going to possibly need some help. So on both sides of the border, there are a lot of issues that affect families, reconfiguration of families, separation of families, language and education issues for kids. So I think I will end there, and we can open up the discussion.
And I would just add that already the people that had been deported during the previous administration to Mexico often caused many challenges for Mexico, as well as suffered great hardship. Many of them would be dumped literally across the border in places like Tijuana or Ciudad Juarez, some of the most violent parts of Mexico at the time, and back up again without documents, without Mexican documents. They could not easily travel back to places that they had come years from because they were caught up in violence. And they would then, ironically, be often subject to rounds up by Mexican law enforcement and end up in Mexican prisons once again, particularly in those two cities under specific law enforcement policies adopted there. So suffering great hardship or being potentially vulnerable to recruitment or coercion by criminal groups. So while President Trump frequently alleges that immigrants are a major source of crime in the United States without any evidence to that effect, in fact, first-generation immigrants tend to have much lower criminal rates, violent criminal rates, than U.S.-born citizens. They would often, when dumped across the border, would come into contact and be subject to coercion from organized crime groups, as well as repressive coercion by Mexican law enforcement. I am delighted to see that we have plenty of time for questions, much more so than the previous two panels, and I will hand it over to you. Please identify yourself, speak into the microphone, because we are also webcasting the event, and direct the questions if you'd like, or ask the panelists. Please, this lady here.
Hi, my name is Audrey Single, and I'm from the Inter-American Foundation. I want to ask, in light of the recent president's budget cuts and proposals, do you see the need do you see the need to continue fighting for federal funding for grassroots and civil society programs within Mexico, especially for like U.S. assistance agencies regarding migration issues?
Thank you. And perhaps gentleman over there.
Hello, my name is Walter Wally. I'm from Tijuana, Mexico. Also a recent graduate student from the George Washington University. And I wanted to ask, what could be the impact of Mexico's internal security law in the fight against organized crime and the security cooperation between the United States and Mexico? Thank you.
And please, yes, the gentleman.
Rahul Desai of Mexico Ventures. My question is particular to Doris and Audrey. Now that we have complete Republican control of the government, Trump's, his brand of Republican, isn't there a chance now for some kind of immigration bill? I mean, it may not have the path to citizenship, but maybe a path to some sort of lesser legal status. And what about the idea of a temporary jobs program? Because I mean, again, for all the migrants who are here for economic reasons, wouldn't it be better if they had a chance to come back and forth rather than having been forced to stay? So I'm just wondering whether there might be an interesting time for an opportunity there.
Thank you, Doris, and Audrey. Let me start with you. And
okay, well, it'll be interesting if we have a similar take on this. Yes, theoretically, this is the kind of a candidate in Congress, executive branch, et cetera, all in Republican hands, where you could envision an immigration bill. But, I think one has to recognize that although the parties, Republican and Democrat, have differed on immigration policy for a long time, it's, I think, very clear that the real deep division on immigration policy changes is within the Republican Party, not between the Republican and the Democratic Party. And so, first off, just setting aside the executive branch, there is that continued fissure between the business, pragmatic, more outward-looking wing of the Republican Party and the more fundamentalist Tea Party, Freedom Caucus elements of the Republican Party. That would have to be resolved. The other thing, of course, that would have to be resolved is the campaign promise that Trump made all along on no amnesty. And although, as you say, it's an obvious compromise on this issue that you do a legal status but not a path to citizenship, and people have talked about that for quite some while as the place where ultimately the differences of opinion could come together. For Trump himself, his policies on immigration have really been check, check, check out of the campaign. He's changed his view on a variety of things. I mean, take NAFTA, take a whole range of issues where he's been perfectly happy to take other positions. On immigration, he actually has really stuck to the script that he laid out during the campaign. So, and given how emotional the legal status, but the amnesty, as it's always labeled, issue is within his core constituency voters, that would be a major breach that they would have to decide on. On the other side is the issue of the DACA population, because that is the one population and the one area of immigration policy where Trump has not moved in the way, moved to do what it is that he promised during the campaign. On the other things, he's really going, as I say, right down the list, but not on DACA. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One of them is that a lot of people immediately after the election got out very aggressively making the case that this population should be protected. And they did seem to pay attention politically that this would be a real hornet's nest if they stepped into it. The other is that they are reported to be holding on to the DACA program as a chip for some kind of bargaining later, which could be holding in reserve the possibility of some sort of immigration reform. But even with imagining that he would be willing and that the administration would be willing to go forward in those ways, what we're seeing is an inability to advance any kind of a legislative agenda. And this is a really tough one to advance as compared to some of the others, infrastructure or whatever, which they haven't been able to move forward on. So an awful lot, I think, depends. It's a very optimistic notion, what it is that you present. It possibly theoretically could happen, but it's pretty hard to see, given what we've seen so far, how as a practical matter that could occur.
Audrey?
I definitely agree with Doris's point of view, and that in theory, the time is ripe politically with all of these things lining up. But I also want to introduce the idea that we have this notion that immigration reform is something doable in one fell swoop, and that we've had a lot of discussions over many decades about how to change things. And it really comes down to whether there are pieces of legislation that could move. And again, if it's with these kinds of bargaining chips or other deals that are struck over time, we might be able to see something move. I think the root issues have to do with the notion that we can seal the border off, and the wall speaks to that, and the impossibility of actually doing that, and also the lack of realism about other people who come into the United States, either legally and overstay, or in some other ways find their way in and become undocumented. But I think there's some agreement that when migration is so low, it's a good time to think about making these changes, because things can move forward and be implemented, when we're not dealing with large numbers. So, as to creating kind of a visa that would allow workers to stay or come in to work in certain industries and occupations, I think there has been a fair amount of discussion about that, and the issues of how to create a fair and reliable, systematic way of doing that for people who are already here, and also for those who would like to join from other places, is one of the big outstanding questions.
And very briefly, the issue of budget cuts and support for NGOs in Mexico. I would like to take one more round of questions.
Yeah, from the other Audrey. Always nice to meet another Audrey. So are you talking about U.S. support of Mexican civil society? So I don't know what the support would be like to increase the funding for that, especially in terms of the budget kinds of considerations that are happening right now. I think there may be incentive within the Mexican government to think about how to fund those kinds of initiatives within Mexico. I think what Mexico may have to deal with over the next couple of years, as we've been talking about here, is ramping up of bureaucratic costs and the kinds of things that would allow people who don't have documentation anymore in their home country, Mexico, to receive that, kind of like what happened during DACA among consulates in the United States when Mexico changed its policies, for example, to issue birth certificates to Mexicans in the United States. So I don't know where the answer is, but maybe it's somewhere in between those two things.
So I'm afraid we will not have time for a second round of questions, but let me briefly address your question. Look, I believe that Mexico itself needs to be interested in its internal security policy. The murder rate that has gone on is terribly destructive to Mexico. And cutting down the murder rate at broader violent crimes such as extortion is critical. And when previous President Felipe Calderón spoke about the murder rate either being a sign of policy success, he was fundamentally wrong. And equally when he said that because it just shows that criminals were criminals, that didn't matter. He was fundamentally wrong because it's tearing away fundamentally at Mexican society. And frankly, because in many parts of Mexico, and not just the Tierra Caliente, criminal groups are the authority, not the state. That said, you heard in the previous discussions that there are many security issues internally to Mexico, not just production and trafficking of drugs, but others that have potential for spilling over the border, including counterterrorism cooperation, that requires very intense and good cooperation. And even during the tough times that you heard about in the 1980s, when U.S. Mexico cooperation was really at all-time low, there still was, at the time, robust counterterrorism cooperation. So Mexico has not, even at the time, resorted to withholding that or cutting that. And I think that is the nuclear option that Mexico could pull, and we are, fortunately, a long way down from it, including because should a terrorist attack come across the southern border, the many political and other repercussions would be enormous. But Mexico could certainly walk away from enforcing immigration issues on the northern border. It could walk away from enforcing immigration issues on the southern border, where Central Americans come from. It could tell U.S. intelligence, law enforcement agents helping with intelligence building as well as institutional change that they are no longer welcome in the United States. Again, not something that is good for the United States, just as it would be harmful for Mexico. And so I very much hope that the Trump administration starts recognizing the value of that relationship and the interconnectedness between economics, immigration, and security issues. With that, let me thank all of you for joining us this afternoon, also for the audience that has joined by the web. I would like, on behalf of Brookings, to thank all of our panelists, Doris and Audrey, as well as Ambassador Gutierrez and former ambassadors Tony Wayne and Arturo Sarucan, who spoke today. This is certainly the beginning or continuation or one point of a conversation and work that on U.S.-Mexico relationship that we are doing it with Brookings and continue to be doing at Brookings. We have a robust agenda across the various dimensions you heard today, with the bilateral relationship broadly, economic issues, migration issues, and security issues, and look forward to being in touch with all of you, continuing to your conversation about the dialogue that really needs to take place not just in Washington, but in the country, not only about what kind of neighbors we want to be, but what kind of country we want to be. Thank you very much.